What's up, everyone? How are we feeling? Feeling ready to talk about fraud prevention and deterrence? Excitement? Even if it's your birthday, this should be exciting to you, okay? Not going to call anybody out, but I didn't mention anybody's name. I didn't mention anybody's name. People who watch this video will say, I wonder who he was talking about. They'll talk about this for generations to come. All right. And everybody here will know. Don't blurt it out. Okay, we want to leave this alone. If you blurt it out, I have to go in and edit the video, and that's not fair. So yeah. Before we get started, just a reminder. I know I've been reminding you guys, but please remember about the 3-minute thesis competition coming up. What do you guys think? Do I need to bribe you all to be a part of it? We've only got one person enrolled or signed up for it right now, and it is one of our accounting students, which is good because that means I get to lord it over the other program, saying, "Yeah, we got the only competitor. We're going to win." Yeah, but yeah, I've heard some stories talking to various individuals that they are concerned that they would not do well. Which I think all the presentations that were done last year were just quite solid, and I would be happy with them. But do we need additional bribery? All right, so I'll keep that in mind. I may come back to you next week with something, okay? But yes, I would not leave that person out, okay? Not knowing who it is, you know, but yeah, I have something in mind. So no idea. Okay, all right. And for those of you concerned about the VITA workday that the competition is taking on, I did ask about that during our graduate council meeting yesterday. There can be accommodations made for that if you want to take part and participate in that. I'm obviously talking about the VITA coordinators. One coordinator specific. I'm talking about Jenna, obviously, specifically referring. Oh, okay. I said I was going to call anybody out, and then I called your name. Okay, is that considered cyberbullying? It is. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. It's going to Zoom. Not going to touch YouTube anymore. Not going to touch YouTube anymore. All right. Today we're talking about fraud prevention and deterrence. So we're going to be taking a closer look at this next 3 weeks. But today we're going to talk about the nature of crime and some associated ethical considerations of criminal behavior. So there's some documents that had handed out. One about reinforcement and punishment, which are related concepts. We'll talk about the nature of those, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail on occupational fraud. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that and talk about some intentions, some things that we knew, some things we may not have known, but had strong inclinations on, and some things that you may have just been surprised with altogether. So first thing we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of reinforcement and punishment. Okay, reinforcement and punishment. John, I'm just curious, when you practice on the soccer team, does your coach rely more on reinforcement or punishment?
Healthy balance.
Yeah. Maybe neither.
Neither. I say so. You don't want to throw the coach under the bus here. That's fair. That's fair. Okay. So what does your group say is the difference between reinforcement? So let's define reinforcement and define punishment. You're gonna handle
reinforcement is when you encourage good behavior by rewarding action you want to see, or the ability to outperform the desired action.
Okay. What is punishment?
Is when you discourage bad behavior by imposing a penalty whenever an undesired action is performed.
Okay. So yeah, I think we probably at a very general level probably had understanding of this. We've heard the terms reinforcement and punishment used in similar contexts. So there's obviously some similarities. What similarities did you define?
I said like they both can be positive or negative.
Okay. And I think that probably you can say they both have to relate to behavior, or more specifically desired behaviors. But what is the big difference that we want to talk about with respect to reinforcement and punishment? Still with you, John. Okay. So basically our difference, it relates in the direction of behavioral responses. Okay. So if we're talking about something positive with respect to reinforcement, we're trying to motivate something. We're trying to positive punishment. We're trying to motivate in the opposite direction and not doing something. So they actually had a good table in there that I thought was kind of a good reference for reinforcement and punishment, is this right here. So saying positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, basically something is added / removed. But if you're adding something for positive reinforcement, you're trying to increase the likelihood of behavior. With respect to positive and negative punishment, you're adding something to decrease the likelihood of behavior. Okay, so let's just go ahead and see if we can figure out some anecdotal examples of all these. I was thinking about these and trying to figure out what would be some best approaches. So positive reinforcement, this is probably the most simple one, is that You say like you're training an animal like a dog, and you're trying to say, all right, I want you to sit. And if they sit, then you give them a treat because that's reinforcing that particular behavior. I realize it in the context of saying, okay, we just talked about fraudsters as dogs, and they are, all right, but very simple context. We can use reinforcement in that context. Negative reinforcement, I think, is a little bit more subtle. We don't really think about negative reinforcement. We tend to associate the term negative as being something contrary or bad. But when we talk about negative reinforcement, we remove something to increase the likelihood of behavior. So the way that I thought about this is that you have a prisoner who has a certain number of years on their sentence, and that's a punitive action. If you remove years from that sentence from good behavior, that's basically saying keep up the good work and you'll be rewarded. So you're not giving them something. There's a perception of receiving something, but instead you're removing something that's punitive in order to increase the likelihood of a good behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, positive and negative punishment, that's where you're basically assigning a punitive assessment instead of removing a punitive assessment, I guess, in this regard. So added to decrease the likelihood of behavior. That's you're a kid and you smack talk and you say something, say a naughty word to your parents, and they say, okay, go sit in the corner. Anybody ever have to sit in the corner as a kid? Yeah. I don't know. I think I was joking around with one of the groups when they were doing the assignment on Tuesday. I said, "Yeah, go to your room, okay, and go to your room." It's like, I don't know. My room was actually pretty cool when I was a kid. You know, it's like that. I had a TV with an Atari 2600 set up. I could go play video games. And I say, "Are you back talking to me? Go talk to. You're gonna go sit in your room for another hour." It's like, all right, sweet, another hour of Space Invaders. All right. All right, but if we're assuming that we're doing something or adding something, some sort of punishment that is not going to be something that they want to do. Now, if they take away your video game system, that would be a combination of that, because they'd say go sit in your room, but your room doesn't have video game system, so it's going to be a removal and addition to something. So both positive and negative punishment. But positive punishment, doing some punitive action and you increase it when you try to say quit doing that, stop doing that. All right. And then removing is to decrease the likelihood of behavior. That would be taking away the video game system. Says, all right, you're going to talk that way, then you can't play video games for weeks. Says, that's not fair. 2 weeks. I mean, I honestly thought when I was a kid, when I would just protest, that was a rational response by any human being. And if I say that's not fair, you shouldn't punish me further for saying that's not fair, because that's a gut reaction. Okay. I realize that has nothing to do with this conversation, but I still don't think it was fair. Okay. I don't think it was fair that when I just immediately blurted out, that's not fair. That's an example of the removal of something to decrease the likelihood of behavior. So don't talk back to your parents, take away the video game system, which I will say more than one time I wrote down on a piece of paper, because that's what we did when a kid. You played video games or you had a piece of paper. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have mobile phones. I just made pictures of myself playing Space Invaders. That's kind of what I had to do whenever I was in this situation. You think that would have made me a better artist, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen. All right. So then we talk about white collar crimes. Anybody ever watch that TV show White Collar back in the day? Yeah. I was really excited when that TV show came out, and I was thinking, okay, this is going to be fantastic. Everybody's going to learn about fraud. And then all we really learned is that Matt Bomer, he's just got these great blue eyes, and just everybody just thought he was just the best looking guy. That's how he got away with white collar crime, is because he was so good looking. All right, but that's basically that was the TV show about. There was some white collar crime in there, but for the most part, it was just mostly a very handsome criminal who managed to get away with stuff because people thought somebody that handsome can't possibly break the law. In your own words, define white collar crime. So I'm going to call on AJ's proxy, Dylan, here. Dylan, what'd your group identify here?
Sorry, I was showing the white collar guy.
Okay, all right.
Very dashing.
He is very dashing, very dashing.
Show.
It is a decent show. I will say it was entertaining more than informative, but it was definitely entertaining. So,
did you ask me the question about the white collar?
Yeah, what is the white collar crime? What's the etymology of this term?
I said it's most commonly associated with fraud or nonviolent crimes involving business people, or more simply those who are not blue collar. And then the term coming from the white button down shirts that people work in offices with. Right,
and so this term actually comes from the 1800s, and they kind of contrast that to a blue collar crime, and as Dylan pointed out. So if you wore blue collar, you were kind of one of those people who worked in factories and you did grunt work. If you're white collar, you were a banker or somebody who was professional, or at least perceived. You weren't necessarily respected, but you were perceived as being in a more respectable profession. And so the crimes that you committed according to that particular scenario were considered to be a higher quality crime as a white collar crime because those are associated with white collar jobs. Now, so again, the source of that kind of comes from that, and we talk about blue collar crime. The way that they contrast that is kind of the grungy crimes, like when you commit simple theft or murder. And the reason that that's such an issue is that because white collar crimes are not really that much more nuanced, but it really depends on the occupation or the position of the person committing the crime and not necessarily the crime itself. If you steal $1,000 by going into a convenience store and breaking up a cash register and taking $1,000 out, that would be construed as kind of a traditional blue collar crime. But if you steal $1,000, which is exactly the same theft, but you do it using a computer to extract funds from somebody's bank account, that's a white collar crime all of a sudden. And so there's a perception when we talk about white collar crime that there's some sort of technology or skill set, at least a higher level or high level of complexity to the crime. So I do think that that term gets bandied about a little bit too frivolously, I guess is the word, simply because we should be able to delineate the nature of crime by the association of blue collar crime versus white collar crime, because sometimes we mean the same thing. It's just the setting that we're talking about. So yeah, they tend to overlap traditional crime. So particularly with misappropriation assets, but they tend to be a little bit more technical in nature. So white collar crime can actually be the same thing as blue collar crime. It just a lot of time relies on what is the environment in which the crime is orchestrated. All right, here comes the fun part. So I had to have you guys brainstorm some reasons why you might commit a crime. So I had you brainstorm 10 reasons. The original question for this called for 5, and I said that was not challenging enough. Okay, so we're going to 10 reasons, and we're going to talk about these. So let's just go ahead and do some of these. So we'll start with Kyle's group. Kyle, give me 3 good ones. What's 3 that your group came up with?
We said for financial gain, because it's fun, and because they think they won't get caught.
Financial gain, because they think they won't get caught, and because it's fun?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you give me an example of a crime that you've committed that you thought was fun?
I don't think that.
Oh, okay. All right. But you've done things for fun, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the same directions. Just because you do things for fun doesn't make them criminal.
Correct.
But you can do criminal things because they're fun. What's an example of a crime that you would commit just because it's fun? Not you, but what's that?
Someone who might speed.
Speeding. Okay. Yeah, that's a good case. Like, yeah, you get that endorphin rush and you're just kind of like saying, okay, blank the police or whatever. It's like, never thought to hear those words come out of Dr. Martin's mouth. They didn't, okay, but you can imagine what I said. But yeah, so some good ones there. All right, Dottie, 3 more.
Because of like peer pressure and then a high pressure.
Okay, yeah, and we can definitely associate with that. So yeah. So I did my own brainstorming list, and I think they were roughly equivalent. So I came up with those, and we're going to talk. So I'm going to come back to Kyle and Dottie, and we're going to talk a little about the factors that come into this. But my own list was economic inequality, mental illness, peer pressure, drugs and alcohol. I think one of the groups had one of those. Yeah, drugs and alcohol. Lack of education, unemployment, sociological factors, financial pressures, performance expectations, and crimes of passion. And so I think that there's probably some overlap in some of those categories, whereas there's also overlap with the ones that Kyle and Dottie just both specified. All right, so yeah, a lot of different reasons. I think we probably could come up with a big long list of these, and much longer than 10, but I think that this is probably sufficient what we're going to do. Now, I think it's a crime causation. If we talked about the ACCT fraud examiner manual theories of crime causation, I probably should have this open. So let me go ahead. I'm gonna pause the recording and I'm gonna open the. All right, I have the theories of crime causation up, but just in case anything came up during that conversation, here's the 1-800 number for Crime Stoppers. Okay, if you all find any crimes that you feel need to be reported, I'm not going to say that I'm throwing you under the bus, but all right. So classical criminology. So how do we define classical criminology? This is basically, I'm gonna make these fairly short and to the point. Okay, fairly short and to the point. But crime for utility. Now, what do I mean by utility? It's kind of the economic thought behind utility, or the philosophical idea for utility is something that could cause happiness. Okay, So for the fun of it, might be a kind of where we classify something crime for utility that would fall under classical criminology. But yeah, basically you get pleasure out of committing a crime and or get some sort of benefit out of committing the crime, maybe not even pleasure. Now there could also be trade-offs. We make the argument here. Keep in mind, utility is the greatest happiness principle. So when we talk about utility, could there be negative externalities? Certainly, but if you think the positive outweighs the negative, then you're going to commit the crime. That's the rationalization behind that. Moving on, we have rational choice theory. Crimes are committed to produce a specific intended benefit. And the idea being that we're going to actually commit that action because it's the rational thing to do. It makes the most sense to commit that action given the circumstances. Is anybody familiar with the story Les Miserables? Heard that story? So it's a book. It's a very long book. If you've read it, you have my sympathy. It's like 1,000 pages. It's also a very well-known musical, if you've ever heard about that. But the whole origin of the story comes from the same thing: is that about a criminal who's sent to prison because his sister's child was starving. Their entire family was starving, and so he tries to steal a loaf of bread and gets caught and gets sent to prison. Now, starvation versus crime getting sent to prison, that's a pretty easy takeaway. It's like trying to save people's lives. You're going to commit that crime because that is a rational choice. Otherwise you starve and you die. And so that's kind of the that was my analogy for that one, trying to figure out what we mean by rational choice theory. Contrast that to routine activities theory is that certain people will always be motivated to commit crime if the opportunities are present. Now, we've already talked about this concept of rationalization with respect to fraud, and that that you have to have a certain level of attitude to commit a crime. But can we say that level of rationalization is the same for every individual? So let's think about it from the context of this classroom. Is every single person in this classroom going to have the same threshold for which they cheat on an exam? Probably not, okay? Some of you have to keep a close eye on, not mentioning any names, okay? Just joking, obviously I'm teasing aside, but if you thought about a scenario where you would never cheat on an exam in a certain instructor's class, and then you find out somebody else was cheating, that means that obviously there was a different constraint present for those two individuals. Some individuals are going to have that lower threshold, and some people may say, I'm going to cheat no matter what because I think that there's a lower cost to that than actually studying or doing something else associated with that. Same can be held true with crimes. There are some people who their rationalization for that is not particularly high. And so how would we address that particularly? Keep in mind, remember we talked about in auditing, we say when we talk about the fraud triangle, I can't affect other people's pressures or can't affect their rationalizations. I can only affect the opportunity. This would be one of those where we're talking about routine activities. We'd want to know what are those routine activities and address those with security precautions. Next is biological theories. Crimes are caused by the physical traits of the criminal. I had noting here that something that we've probably seen in the past, higher levels of testosterone and adrenaline. If people are in a scenario where they're not necessarily thinking rationally, they may commit crimes. Has anybody heard the term road rage before? I think most people have heard that term. That's something that a rational human being would not do, but because they're caught up in the heat of the moment, they commit the crime. And so that might be an example of a biological theory. Culture and crime. Crimes are a product of criminals' culture. So there's the argument of nature versus nurture, and what eventually kind of defines who we become as individuals. If we grow up in a very, very hostile environment, a very, very poor, very aggravated environment, then that might actually lead us to taking actions that normal other people in more suitable environments may not take. So we talk about culture, and it goes beyond that. We can talk about individualism versus collectivism. This has to do with kind of traditional culture identities in the world. The United States tend to be very individualistic, whereas some places, the Asian countries, tend to be a little bit more collective. We're not so much concerned about hurting other people in the United States. I'm saying, generally speaking, we're not so much concerned about hurting other people as long as it benefits us. Whereas there's a lot of concern about the collective whole and the good of the collective whole in other countries. It's not to say that we as people in the United States are all awful individuals. I'm just saying that in general, that's kind of the prevailing view. Psychological theories. Criminal behavior is the product of mental processes, and that's basically the way to define it is that the way that your brain works defines whether or not you're going to commit a crime, which there's definitely some overlap in things we've already talked about right there. Social structural theories. The nature of society dictates that crimes committed. If society is kind of nurturing and makes a person's life better, then they're less likely to commit a crime. If society is hostile, then that's going to create a much easier environment for people to commit crimes, especially if they're very forgiving. This kind of goes back to the culture and crime. There's definitely some overlap there, but this is more about the nature of society rather than the nature of the individual's evolution in that society. Finally, social process theories. Crime is a function of the individual's social and psychological interactions with other members of society. So talking a little bit more about what the kind of experiences everybody's grown up in. You can be a part of a society that's hostile. You can grow up in hostile environments, but if you had good interactions with other people, maybe that prevails over that. So a lot of different directions there. You could actually go into a lot more detail. I kind of glossed over the psychological theories and the social process theories because there's a lot more in there. But for the most part, I think that's a good cross section of the types of theories that we're talking about here. And your list may be slightly different depending on the source you looked at, but I think overall we got some general identification there. All right, going back, let's go ahead and talk about the examples. So Kyle gave me 3 examples. What was your first example again, Kyle? Financial gain. What did your group identify for a theory of crime causation for financial gain?
So rational.
Yeah, so I'd say irrational, especially if we're talking about financial gain is going to be the financial gain you experience is going to be greater than the loss that somebody else experiences. We examine this in the kind of the Robin Hood theory. When I say Robin Hood, I'm not talking about the trading app, okay? Talking about the old school story about Robin Hood, steal from rich, give to the poor. The rich need it less, so we can rationalize the actions because the poor need it more. What's another example that you gave? The one about fun.
Psychological.
Okay, yeah, some people are actually look at that. So it's fun. I want to do it. I'm going to do it. Okay, very good. What was your third one?
Thinking they won't get caught.
Thinking we get caught. Okay, so that's a very interesting one. Something we're going to talk a little bit about later. But what would you identify that?
We said it's also rational.
Okay, so yeah, that's kind of the rationalization that people take actions, and assuming they don't get caught. It's kind of a spoiler for what we're going to talk about in a little bit. Crimes get committed under the assumption that you won't get caught. Anybody who thinks they will get caught, or at least I'd say the majority of people who commit a crime and they know they will get caught are not going to commit it. There are external circumstances. There are exceptions to that rule. Okay, but for the most part, people do not get crimes under the assumption that they're going to get caught for committing that crime. Dottie, what was the first one she identified? For status, all right. And what would that example? What would be an example of that from the theories? Straying theory. Okay, which does that fall under? One of the ones that we talked about? Social structure theory. Okay. And so that makes sense because we're talking about social structure. So if we're talking about social structure and what we concern our perception of society, that would definitely be a relevant concern, not irrelevant, a relevant concern. All right. What's the second one you talked about? For attention, and where would that fall? Personality theory. Okay. Does that fall under one of the ones? Okay, yes, that's a part of psychological theories. Okay, yeah. Okay, and yeah, if people have a need for attention and need to be acknowledged, then certainly that's going to be defined under that. And what was the third one? Okay, and where does that fall? Social learning. Okay, so that'd be one of the social theories. So we certainly we talked about those. Yeah, all of these kind of defined by social norms and social constraints. I guess technically first and the third one. The second one would be a psychological theory. It'd be more about what's in a person's head, how the black box is constructed. So good identification there. I do think that it's important to identify that these theories do not necessarily, they're not necessarily a straight path. And there's definitely some overlap in theories, but there's also some market deviation here. What might actually be applicable in one scenario is not necessarily going to be applicable in another scenario. I could pick out 2 individuals in the room, even the 2 who are twins in this room. I could pick out 2 individuals, and their cognitive processes that go into what their decision making is going to be completely different. Okay, because we're all different psychologically. We all have different experiences growing up, so we're going to make different decisions based on our upbringing. Which something to be able to acknowledge that is really important because we can't have to understand that even if we don't find something particularly rational or logical, that doesn't mean that people will not take that action anyway. I can tell you right now, like the Super Bowl celebration, what is the point of looting the city that you grew up in when their Super Bowl team wins? That's just really weird to me, don't you think? Yeah, but I didn't grow up in Philadelphia, so I can't really tell you. So yeah. Ding on Philadelphia for being KC. That's what I can say. All right, moving on to question number 5. Relating back to question 1, in your opinion, which method is more important for a company to prevent fraud? So we're talking about reinforcement versus punishment, and provide some reasoning for your conclusion. All right, Colin, what's your group say on this one?
You said reinforcement is more important than prevention because individuals, we thought individuals were more motivated by receiving certain benefits than by taking them away.
Right. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's presumably easier to promote desired behaviors through training, particularly in a workplace environment. Okay. Especially if the training and the reinforcement is transparent and clear, people can understand this is what I'm supposed to accomplish. Whereas through punishment, they may know that they did something wrong, but they may not be familiar with what they did wrong. But there's a more subtle reason. So Kyle, what was your third reason again that you talked about, the third crime that you committed? So we talked about 3 crimes that your group identified, 3 reasons of crime. What was the third one you said? Right. Okay. People do not commit crimes under the assumption they're going to get caught. People do not actually take certain actions assuming they get caught. So when we talk about punishment, deterrence is not a very good form of stopping desired actions, because deterrence traditionally has not worked. Many studies have shown that. We hear the term deterrence, like, okay, if I think I'm going to punish, I'm going to stop it. And to some small degree, it will work. But when people are kind of caught in the heat of the action and they're not really thinking about it, they're not thinking about what is my penalty for this action. They're thinking, I'm just going to commit this action because I want to. And so punishment is generally not going to be an operative condition in that particular situation. So yeah, so most criminals will not commit crimes they believe they would get caught, so they must improperly assume that they won't get caught. So I think the reinforcement condition is probably what we need to rely on more when we think about how we actually prevent fraud, as assumed to saying that we're going to punish people and people know what that punishment is. Again, so yeah, this is kind of an important point to take. I'm probably going to see a lot more of this moving forward in this course, is the idea of deterrence being ineffective. That is not to say that you can't have preventative mechanisms in place. It just means those preventative mechanisms need to be more about stopping things from happening, rather than trying to motivate people to stop those actions. All right, question number 6. According to Occupational Fraud 2024 report to the nations, only 27% of the cases were convicted at trial. Why do you think this is the case? Holden, what'd your group say?
We said that it might be easier just to settle the cost of litigation fees might be more. And just either firing the employee or settling with them.
Right. So something we don't think about, we think everybody who identifies a fraud, every company that identifies a fraud should take punitive actions or take criminal actions against them. But there are costs associated with taking those actions. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind, is that they may just want to take the costs that they've already incurred and run rather than incurring more costs. Also, people are going to make the argument that by enforcing these criminal actions, it sends a signal to future fraudsters or future criminals that you better be aware that there's going to be punishment in the future if you're not careful. What did we just establish about deterrence? That doesn't work. Okay, so if we are under the assumption that criminal deterrence does not work, what is the motivation to try to go to trial? Very little, very minor. Okay, it's just additional costs that are imposed upon the organization. All right, same report states only 69%, although I'm told this maybe 67%. Okay, do we have clarification on that particular point? Maybe a typo. Okay, 67% of report cases are discipline internally terminated the individual. So basically 2/3 of the cases terminated the individual, meaning 1/3 did not terminate the individual. So somebody committed fraud in your organization. It's like, oh, that's fine. Don't let it happen again. Does that seem problematic to anybody else in this room? What might be the reason for that? What might be the reason that this number is not higher? Back to you, John.
You said that there's a perception that white collar crime doesn't affect people, so there's less sympathy. And then we said in many valuable cases that white collar crime usually have an impact with companies. Because of this, it makes it difficult to remove that person from the company right away.
So this is actually going to be a series of costs that are associated with the organization, but not necessarily monetary costs. John pointed out that there could be reputation loss to the organization, the perception that they're not effective in their roles at committing or stopping fraud, or possibly that there could be sympathy for the criminal rather than the company organization itself. You know, I know this is a dark one to think about, but Luigi Mangione and United Healthcare. All right. Does anybody remember what happened after that incident happened? Was Luigi Mangione like, that's terrible. Murder should never happen. This guy's a dirty killer. Was what the response was by many people in society? A lot of people were praising him, saying, yeah, this guy's a martyr. It's like, that's really kind of dark if you're an organization, if your criminals are going to be treated as illustrious individuals. All right. Now, I'm not trying to dictate your position on this. Okay. You may have had some fun with this one, but for that one, that's kind of an example of what John is talking about. A little bit more direct. Let's assume that you have evidence, but you're not willing to share that evidence of the people who were terminated. And so you terminate that individual and they turn around and issue a lawsuit against you. And then they said, well, okay, you're issuing filing a lawsuit against the company for firing you, saying it was saying that termination without cause. It says yes. If they had actually committed the fraud, or if I had committed the fraud like they said, they would have taken me to trial. They did not take me to trial because remember we just identified that only 27% of the cases go to trial. So if I committed this fraud, they would take me to trial. So I must not have committed the fraud. They're firing me without cause. Does that sound like a logical argument? I sad to say that sounds like a really logical argument. That sounds like a very logical argument. So they may be afraid of the kind of the costs that are imposed on them, whether that actually be a reputational cost or the potential that they could go to trial against the individual if they terminate them, even though they knowingly committed a fraud. So that's something very, very concerning about that. Now, what is going to be the response to that? I think the response is that we need to be a little bit more constructive about how we consider fraud and fraud punishment in that regard. It's very, very easy to say, yeah, this is not something that we're going to do because we don't want to incur additional costs. But then we get to the point that people might actively commit fraud because again, they don't think they're going to get caught and they have rational belief behind that because they can look at these scenarios or these surveys and say, yeah, even if I do get caught, I'm not going to trial. They're just going to fire me. Or sometimes 1/3 of the cases, they may not fire me at all. I don't know. That seems like a fraudster's paradise to me. That's what I'm came to take away. So fortunately, not many fraudsters are going to be reading ACFE report to the nation. So at least that's what I assume. It is probably available. All right. For the figure 13 in occupational fraud 2024, did any of the results surprise you? So I guess I should probably open this up. So let me go ahead and put that open. It's me being lazy and just wanting to try to do the least amount of work possible. Does anybody else in that boat with me want to try to do the least amount of work possible? I'm just kind of curious, you know. Does anybody get utility out of work? It's a joke that we had going on in the PhD program where I'm in figure 43. I'm way past where I need to be. I should know what page this is on. I think I had it on the that's prevention, or maybe it's detection. There we go. Figure 13. All right. So what do we see that stands out amongst all these? Let's call the group. Dylan, what stands out?
The majority of detections are made with tips.
Mm-hmm. So any of the results surprise you?
The groups that external audit may go up only 3%. All detections was a little surprising.
So by the way, does anybody remember I actually gave you the same scale? It was a little bit older survey, but I said external auditors caught what percentage of frauds that were reported? Does anybody remember the percentage I reported back in 417? 2%. It was 2%. Yeah. Good memory. All right. Yeah. 2%. So 2 to 3% are captured by external audit. So there's actually a question on that. It's like, why are more fraud cases not caught in audits? What did your group speculate on, Dylan?
We said that since audits, or external audits are outside parties, they can only see a certain degree of the business operations.
Okay.
While internal parties, such as the individuals that are giving the tips, see more of the business more of the time. And sometimes the materiality threshold is too large for small frauds to be detected. Yeah,
there's a lot going against the external auditors because remember, external auditors, their responsibility is to detect frauds that have a direct and material effect. And they're outside parties that are coming in for a limited period of time. They do not have the knowledge of operations, nor do they have an innate necessity to understand operations. because they were reporting on the reports, financial reporting, and the mechanisms there. So somebody who's going to be inside the organization is going to be much more likely to be able to depict what's happening in the organization if something bad is happening. What do you think the most likely party is going to be that's going to be identified in these tips? And so figure 14 kind of hashes that out. Looks like the employees are probably the ones who are most reporting in tips. Does that make sense to everyone? I mean, it makes intuitive sense. Like 50% of the cases, somebody inside the organization sees something wrong and says, this is bad. And if they've got a completely obscure line that they can report through, where there's no chance of reprisal against them, then they're going to be the most likely to report. They're going to say, I'm an employee in this organization. I see something bad going on. No, I don't want to report my name. I don't want to actually have anybody retaliate against me. But yeah, if that's the case, then employees are going to be the most likely stakeholder in that regard. It's very interesting because I think the next one is the customer. Customer is the most likely, and then anonymous, we don't know, but vendor after that. So kind of all the stakeholders in supply chain that we identified that have knowledge about the organization's operations. But by far is going to be the employee with the highest level of knowledge. All right, last question. Unless you guys want to start talking about more crimes again. All right. Do you believe the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners Code of Professional Ethics needs to be stricter or more detailed than other codes? Okay. So Kyle, what is your rational response to this particular question?
We said it doesn't really need to be stricter than other codes, but it needs to be more than what it is now.
You're probably right. You're probably right. So it doesn't necessarily need to be stricter other codes, but we do need to have clearly defined lines. But why is ethics such an important detail with respect to the ACFE code or ACFE, the Code of Professional Ethics? Why are we so ingrained in this concept of ethics? So what is one of the very first things that I told you at the beginning of the course? What am I teaching you in this course at a very basic level? How to commit fraud, okay? So if you wanted to leave here, it's like saying, Dr. Barnes gave all the skills I need to become a white collar criminal. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. I'm going to make you proud, okay? And you would in your very own way. But ultimately speaking, what am I relying on very heavily by teaching you how to commit fraud? I'm also teaching you, giving you the tools to actually detect, prevent, and detect fraud. And you have to make the decision about which you're going to utilize. Now, some of you may be on rational choice theory and says, you know what? I can commit a fraud and I get away with it for a while, but at some point I will get caught and I have to accept that that's a reality. It's just not worth it. And if that's your decision parameters, fine, okay? If that's all that's preventing you from committing fraud, I guess that's good enough. But my goal would be is that you would be looking at the utility and saying, even though I think that I would get some benefit out of it, the harm that I would cause would be much greater than the good that I would create through committing fraud. I can do a lot more good by using my skills and my knowledge to prevent these things from happening, which is an ethical approach. Now, ethics are not necessarily aligned just to utility. We talked about this for those of you who are in auditing. We talked about ethical frameworks. Okay, remember we talked about the 6 ethical frameworks in auditing, and we said all of these are interpretations of actions that you can take and how you should evaluate them. And I'm sure that everybody in this room has had some sort of context in other classes where you talked about ethical decision making. The importance of ethics is that is what constrains your actions, not the action, not the fear of reprisal, okay, not the deterrence, not the concern that this is going to be detected somehow. Everybody in this room is smart enough to commit a crime and get away with it. And I shouldn't be telling you that, okay, because it's like Dr. Barnes said we should commit crimes. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying everybody can commit a crime and get away with this. What's restricting you from doing that is your better reason, your better judgment, and understanding that it's not what you should be doing. And there's various ways I can justify that to you. I can say that you're creating more harm than good. Okay, that's a utilitarian theory. I could say it's wrong to do something like that. Would you like somebody to do something like that to you? And you say no. So, well, if you don't like that action against you, you shouldn't do it to somebody else. That's the deontological theory, universal maxim. There's a lot of different approaches to this, but we have to have very, very clear lines of ethics so that we make sure that when we use our abilities are used for good. What is that? What is the Spider-Man saying that he says in all the movies? Okay, Uncle Ben always says in all the movies. With great power comes great responsibility. Okay, you all are Spider-Man. Okay, you got all those skills. Okay, now your skills are not zipping web lines and swinging from buildings, but much greater responsibility than that. That's a reality. And so yeah, it makes you feel like a superhero. Great. If it makes you feel foolish, that's fine too. But don't commit fraud. That's all I'm telling you. That's all I'm telling you. All right, quiz time. All right, it's presentation time. We're going to hear all about the world of FIFA You know, I really should have thought this over too. Having the soccer guys present this would have just been perfect, you know, I only got one. It was a random. Colin and Holden, I hope you're not mad at me and won't hold it against me. If you want to put in my evaluations that I did not theme this very well, that's fair.
Controls Matt.
Oh, you can take it if you want.
No, I'm taking it.
Yeah, FIFA, let's do it.
So the investigation started in 2010. The FBI was investigating Russian organized crime, and then in 2011, the IRS was investigating Chuck Blazer, who we talked about more later. But he was a FIFA executive and who was being investigated for tax evasion. And then later, the FBI and IRS joined forces to investigate corruption in the FIFA World Cup bidding process for the World Cup that was happening in Russia 2018 and then Qatar in 2022. And then the reason the US was able to get involved was because American banks were being used. The investigation involved over 33 countries. And by the end, there was 150 million of bribes and kickbacks that was being paid to FIFA executives.
So Chuck is like the only named person we got. He was an executive committee member of the International Federation Association of Football, FIFA. Federation International is just in 2011, the IRS began to investigate him for failure to file his income taxes. That's also how they got Al Capone. Blazer became an informant. He exposed a $10 million bribe from South Africa to host the 2010 World Cup. And the bribes had been going on since the 1990s and included broadcasting rights, merchandise, sponsorship deals, a whole lot of stuff.
So others involved, 16 more officials were charged for involvement in the scheme. Chuck was the only one that they mentioned, but like I said, 16 other officials were also charged. 2 other officials surrendered, and then most people who were indicted pleaded guilty. In 2015, 14 FIFA officials and marketing executives were indicted by the US Department of Justice. They were charged with wire fraud, racketeering, and money laundering.
So in the end, the scandal led to global investigations into FIFA officials, rushing returns, denied wrongdoing, but they also proceeded to host the 2018 and 2022 World Cups respectively. And FIFA introduced stricter bidding regulations for the 2026 World Cup.
So we got. Oh.
Okay, we also had the FIFA case. Yeah. Oh, shoot. Okay.
It's the entire presentation.
Yeah, just on a loop. So starting off with the opportunity, there are very few rules for the FIFA hosting process. And then for motive and pressure, hosting the World Cup is a big deal. It brings a lot of prestige to the country. And then it also brings in a lot of tourism, which is more money for them. It also will strengthen their reputation. And then there's also like broadcasting rights that were another incentive.
And as for the rationalization, everyone was doing it, kind of like they mentioned, there were 33 countries involved in the fiasco. And then in addition, kickbacks aren't necessarily legal in all countries. Like there were a few countries who like didn't even take blame for what was happening. And then lastly, they've been doing it since the 1990s. So they're like, why stop?
Lessons learned. International regulations are really hard to impose / enforce. Like Sydney said, even if something's legal or illegal in one country, it may not be legal or illegal in another country. But just because it's legal somewhere else doesn't mean it's okay to do. Especially if you're getting multiple countries involved, and particularly the United States doesn't like to play nice with anybody. We also said that corruption is a slippery slope that leads to more parties being involved. If they started in the 1990s, then other people heard about it. They're just going to offer more and more money to host the FIFA tournaments, and then greed and dishonesty can ruin an organization.
That's all.
So as the other group is getting up, I just have a quick question to pose to everyone. This is a class question, but so one of the arguments that we've seen about corruption is that it's other countries can do it, but the US is kind of constrained by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Do you think that that's an appropriate rationalization for committing a corrupt act if for the United States? I'm not going to try to justify other countries because again, they didn't take responsibility because they said it's perfectly legal in our jurisdiction. But is that a reasonable justification for committing a corrupt act? Is that saying that they'd be at a competitive disadvantage if they weren't? International laws are real. Well, I mean, international standards, let's put it that way. What the standards are in different countries. Should we be forced to follow the US rules even for operating jurisdictions outside of the United States? No. So some people say yes, some people say no, and I guess the ultimate answer is that we have every question like this. It depends.
Okay, I don't know what's going on with the presentation, so you get to see all of PowerPoint. Our presentation is on the Ponzi scheme with Lou and the boy bands. So looking at parties involved, really the case just centered around Lou Pearlman, but it also had implications for the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Natural, which was another boy band, Cheney Mason, who was Pearlman's first defense lawyer, and then other bands that Pearlman was involved in. So looking at who is Lou, he was born in New York and he was fascinated with blimps. And in the 1970s, he founded a helicopter taxi service company, and eventually moved into blimp leasing when I guess that didn't work out for him. So he started Airship International, and he first started out with, I think, 3 or 4 blimps. And by 1980, his last blimp crashed. That's what we imagine it looking like. It was shortly after takeoff. And then in 1985, he decided to go public with his company and raise $3 million in what everyone believed was a pump and dump scheme, but we didn't find any more information about that. And then in 1992 and 1994, the company lost $2 million and $4 million respectively. And then in the meantime, he also created a private air charter company, which flew musicians worldwide. And this is where he met New Kids on the Block. He was very interested on why members of a boy band could actually afford a private jet. So he wanted to know how much they were making and stated that he was in the wrong business.
So more about Lou. In 1992, he officially entered the music industry, and his first band he found was the Backstreet Boys. So he poured millions of dollars into this band, even though his other business, Airship International, was suffering millions of dollars of losses. And this, sadly, his last blimp flew in 1995. But in 1997, the Backstreet Boys' first major hit came out, Quit Playing Games. It's a good one. I was listening to it this morning. Click clang. My bad. That sold $2 million copies, so that's made him a lot of money. And then he used the same kind of formula that he used with the Backstreet Boys to sign a bunch of different other bands and try to make them famous. So moving on to more of this scheme, as people, all the people that were interested in all his bands, he lured them to invest in his other business, which he claimed, which was under one of his other businesses. And he said this included airlines, film and music studios, talent, travel agencies, restaurants, and real estate, just for people to invest in. And then he also claimed he opened a FDIC insured savings programs for these investors also under Transcontinental Airlines and Transcontinental Airlines travel services, but none of these existed. So this is like a real quote from somebody. He's like, the first thing they would do is show you this business card that folds. A business card that folds with like 40 to 50 companies on it. And this would make him seem like he knew what he was doing and he had a lot of businesses under him. But he basically just defrauded investors about $300 million.
Yeah, so the result was Lou basically took advantage of his bands and he made himself like the sixth member and the band members didn't even know about it. So Backstreet Boys sued Lou in 1998, accusing him that he stole $10 million while they only made 300,000. And then Backstreet Boys and NSYNC fired him as the manager. And then 2006, Kyle mentioned his defense lawyer also sued him because he didn't pay him back in legal fees. And then this resulted in more lawsuits. So eventually money laundering, conspiracy, and making false claims of bankruptcy. So he fled the country as a result, and then he was finally caught in Indonesia. And he had a sentence of 25 years in the federal prison. He died in prison. And then there's still $400 million that's unsettled.
I don't really care. I don't.
I hope you guys
I
have
can-
something impressive.
you can-
It's gonna be hard to beat Brock singing quickly again.
I was planning on singing.
Oh, it can't be.
Yeah, just like.
This happened to us last week. That's what I.
So can we just do like that, maybe? Does that work? If I. Nope. All right. What should we do here? Just do it.
You guys are gonna probably get a sneak peek of her.
All right.
Yeah, so we had also that same case. Essentially Kyle kind of talked about the opportunity that he saw. The new kids on the block or whatever, that he was starting his business or just doing everyday business, and he took the new kids on the block on like a trip or something, and then they talked to him, found out how much money they were making, and he was like, oh yeah, I want to get a part of this. And so essentially he just had the capital to try and make that strategic move into the industry.
And then for pressure, we said that he obviously had like his other failing businesses, like Brock talked about with the $2 million loss and $4 million loss. And so he like was already kind of running a Ponzi scheme before, so he just like couldn't stop, and it was all just like piling on. So it just kept going. And then for rationalization, he obviously wanted money. This was his house. And then like another one was that he like was creating successful boy bands. So, you know, it could be rationalized that he was helping them out. So
And before you switch, so
Oh,
that
yeah.
picture is Bali in Indonesia.
this is him in Bali eating dinner.
Right before he got caught.
Yeah.
And then for the lessons learned, so like on the side of the fraudster, Ponzi schemes will always come crashing down eventually when you run out of money. And then on the investor side, it's really on the investor like scrutinize the businesses and the programs they're investing in. Because a lot of them were like, they saw that business card with all these businesses and they just thought, this guy has to be important. But really, it was all a scheme. So making sure you like really look into that and investigate the companies that you're putting millions of dollars into before you do that.
Our last slide was Kirsten's favorite photos.
I really love that airplane picture. It's so funny. Just picture them all flying.
Yeah, picture them flying in, it was animated.
So I wonder if you opened that directly in PowerPoint instead of running it through the browser window until it solved the problem. I didn't think about that until after you started that.
The Backstreet Boys just announced they're playing at the Sphere like 7 days in a row this summer. So they're still pumping and going. They didn't get slowed down.
We should ask Leah to fix the problem.
I was thinking that whole time, I was like, I wonder if you refresh. Woo.
All right, technical consultant Leah.
Thank you. Oh no. Is it not us yet? It's not us yet. It's what, I was wondering why I was getting up here. No one else was coming.
We're solving problems.
No, you can go.
Yeah,
I saw.
You did saw that, everything.
I wonder if we align a visit to site to Las Vegas with the CPA exam prep this summer, you know, it's just, yeah.
I think it's after.
Oh, okay, celebration for everybody who finished the CPA exam.
So we're presenting on waste heap and fraud, the waste management fraud scandal. So a little bit about Waste Management. This is the company that actually committed the fraud. It was founded in 1968, located in Texas. It is a pretty big company. It has 20 million customers, and they specialize in managing and reducing waste and recycling and disposal services. So a little bit about what happened and how it happened. So senior executives had had to meet predetermined earnings targets, and they were not meeting those targets. So some of the ways that they met those targets was by manipulating financial entries and foregoing expenses. So they would avoid depreciation, they would inflate or assign salvage values to equipment, and then they extended the useful life of garbage trucks. So, and for their foregoing expenses, they didn't record expenses for value of landfill, and they didn't write off unsuccessful projects. And their expenses kind of totaled 490 million, which they did not recognize, which totaled pretty much into 1.7 billion in earnings restatements from 1992 to 1997. And how they got away with it for so long. So they're a publicly traded company, and they obviously had to be audited. But the auditor that they hired was bribed by stakeholders. But they were eventually caught when there was a new CEO. And he kind of requested a review of the accounting practices. And so Dean Buntrock is one of the founders of and CEOs of Waste Management, and he was kind of the guy that got the ball rolling with the fraud scheme. And he pretty much just let greed take over.
And some other key parties, we start with Philip Rooney. He was the former president of Waste Management. He kind of helped to encourage the various misstatements. James, I don't know how to pronounce that.
Cody.
Probably. He was the CFO. He was very responsible for some of the manipulation of the data, and he did train at Arthur Andersen as an auditor, which is important later. And this is not him. The rest of these pictures are just people who have the unfortunate, they just share the name, so. The next one is Thomas Howe. He was the CAO. He was also playing key roles in actually changing the records and other various accounting practices. He trained at Arthur Andersen as an auditor for 30 years and was a partner for 30 years. And he was kind of the head of their audit division and the head of their waste management account before moving to work with waste management. And then Herbert Gentz was general counsel, and he was heavily involved in covering up the fraud.
Bruce Tovexon is the vice president of finance, participated in the financial misrepresentations. And he was the one who was the audit manager for waste management, worked for Arthur Andersen. Then the main party involved, Arthur Andersen. Obviously, a lot of these people we had mentioned all were in this company. Again, they're involved in some fraud. The CFO and CAO of Waste Management both worked and trained at Arthur Andersen. They accepted bribes from waste management officers and basically found errors in waste management books, proposed adjustment entries, and kind of just refused to make those adjustments.
They were offered money outside their original agreement to do the audit for waste management. And to conceal the fraud and try and cover it up as best they could. They eventually ended up being fined at the end of the case was 7 million. So some more like punishments and results of the case. These weren't in the article we looked at, but kind of we just looked them up. SEC fined Arthur Anderson a total of 7 million. Robert, who is the head partner on waste management, was fined 50,000 and got stripped off of all of his duties for 5 years. Dean Bunrock, he paid 19 million, including 2,300,000 in civil penalties. Phil Bruni paid 8 million, including 1 million civil penalties. Thomas Howe paid almost 2 million, including 430,000 civil penalties. Gens paid 1,200,000 in civil penalties, and the former CFO paid 2.5 million after the settlement of the case SEC versus James ONA.
That's it.
All right, leave it your time.
Oh, okay.
Refresh.
Yeah, we'll see if it works this time. Proactive. Oh, it doesn't. Oh. There we go.
Sweet.
This is trashy fraud. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start with pressure. The executives were trying to meet these earning targets, so by committing these frauds, they were able to meet them. They felt pressure to do so. And then they had compensation tied to their earnings, which we'll talk a little bit more about the lessons learned. Rationalization, they were already committing fraud. Why not bribe the auditors? It was the only way to get away with it. They were able to bribe Arthur Anderson. And then tied to the compensation tied to earnings to prevent engagement of the officers. If they weren't making enough money, they'd either be fired or not paid. And then these are temporary adjustments. We will fix them later. That was another rationalization made by the executives.
So for opportunities, it was mainly because it was such a high level fraud, like almost all the executives were involved in it. This made it really easy for them to manipulate those like financial reports. So that was kind of the biggest thing. But then the second biggest thing was that most of them had close ties with their auditor, Arthur Anderson. And the article kept saying like comfy relationships or something like that. So it's just like, they were so closely, had such a close relationship with their auditor that was really easy to bribe them and hide the fraud. So all of that was kind of just a big opportunity.
So some lessons and solutions in regards to having that cozy relationship between the company that's being audited and the company that's doing the auditing. Switch auditors often. Make sure that you're not hiring people who previously audited your company to be in positions of power, and then have controls in place to prevent conflicts of interests on kind of the executive side of the company, not making compensation based on company's earnings to lessen the incentives of fraud. That's kind of a given. There's kind of a argument you can make there of why you should have the stock price being an executive's compensation relying on the stock price and why not. Having strict controls over financial reporting to make sure that there are no misstatements, and then ensure that the tone at the top is an ethical one.
I feel like it's a really common theme in public accounting. It's just like a personal ad lib to like, you go work for like a big CPA firm and then you get pulled into industry from a firm that you like audited or worked on in tax. So it's just interesting to see there needs to be some kind of balance between that and then having like a big conflict of interest. Yeah.
Not necessarily relevant to this course, but it will be relevant in the other course that many of you are in. We'll actually talk about the nature of relationships between clients and auditors. But yeah, this was an interesting case in the fact that this occurred shortly before Enron took place, and it was kind of something that added to the whole reporting crisis that was going on in with respect to fraud in large companies. Obviously Anderson's no longer around, so this is one of the things that contributed to the downfall, it's kind of a collapse of the trash heap, so to speak, so. All right, have a good rest of your day. See you all next week.